Hi, everybody. I'm Britany Lewis, a breaking news reporter here at Forbes. Joining me now is Gulnoza Said with the Committee to Protect Journalists. I want to discuss the Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich, who was charged with espionage in Russia at the end of March. When you first heard that allegation, tell us, what did you think?
There were lots of thoughts. The immediate one was how serious the charge was. And it was, we are used to Russian authorities charging journalists with all sorts of crimes, especially in recent years, especially in the past 12 or 13 months since the start of the full-scale invasion. But the espionage charge in regards of an American journalist was something new.
Can you put this more into context for us? You said that these charges were ramping up, but why specifically Evan and why now? Does this have anything to do with worsening tensions between the US and Russia and the West as a whole?
It definitely has to do with the relationships of Russia and the Western countries, particularly the United States, but it also has to do with the state of press freedom in Russia. As I said, in the past 12 or 13 months, the Russian authorities have practically eliminated all independent media. And it was just a matter of time before they would turn their attention from local independent reporters to foreign correspondents based in Russia. So Evan is one of the biggest cases. There have been other cases of foreign journalists, particularly European journalists, who did not get their accreditations extended and had to leave Russia. But the espionage charge is the first one since the Cold War. And speaking about the relationships between Russia and the West, when you look at the Russian pro-Kremlin media, they report about the conflict in Ukraine as if it's not the war against the Ukrainian authorities, it's not the fight for the Ukrainian territories only, but it's the fight against the West, or as they usually use the term Anglo-Saxon countries or civilization even. So this is the fight as they see it against the United States, the UK, other European countries, the NATO in general.
According to the Associated Press, Evan will be behind bars in a Moscow prison called Lefortovo. What do we know about that prison? What do we know about the conditions he's facing? And in general, do we know how he's doing?
His lawyers were able to see him last week on Tuesday, but he hasn't had a consular access, although this is his right. And it's the Russian authorities that have been preventing the U.S. embassy and consulate members to see Evan Gershkovich in violations of his rights. When the lawyers, Russian lawyers, were able to see him, they said that he was in good spirits, he was joking, probably, he was probably thinking about his parents, who are obviously very concerned about him. The Lefortovo detention center is one of the strictest in Moscow. It's notorious for its conditions, and we've spoken to some other former inmates of Lefortovo, including journalists, and they said that the worst thing about it is that the authorities try to isolate a person who is there. So one journalist described the conditions there as, complete isolation in a small cell, 3 by 3 meters, or not much bigger, in which an inmate spends 23 hours and 1 hour during the day he is allowed to walk outside, but not to communicate. And also, when the lawyers met with Evan Gershkovich, they said it was in the presence of the third person. Even if there is no one physically present when they are meeting, the conversations are probably going to be recorded. So it's not like Evan's, basic rights are going to be respected in Russia.
That sounds psychologically taxing, those conditions that you've just described. But can we trust what, in your experience, can we trust what these Russian lawyers are saying? Because that complete isolation sounds grim, to put it lightly, but they're saying that he's laughing. Do we believe that? Can we believe what they're saying?
I trust the journal because they've had people, including the chief of the bureau there, and Evan worked there. But it's very difficult to find a lawyer who would be willing to defend an American journalist charged with espionage in the first place. Because in recent years, a lot of lawyers have fled Russia for the same reasons. A lot of journalists have fled Russia because they were independent. They were defending clients who had anti-Kremlin views. And as far as I understand, it wasn't easy for the journal to find a local lawyers who would be willing to defend Evan Gershkovich. And as to the trust, I think we have to wait and see how the procedure goes. Also, don't forget that we're not talking about a country with the rule of law here. It's a very political case. So what these lawyers can do, they can follow certain procedural steps, the basic ones. For example, they appealed against the detention itself, but they can't do much especially because this is an espionage case. And because of how the Russian state media have portrayed Evan as if he was already a convicted spy, I don't think the lawyers will have really a chance to defend Evan according to even the Russian legislation and the constitution. I think the Russian state media already convicted Evan, even from the way they have been reporting about him, and even high-level Russian government officials have spoken about Evan as if he was already convicted. So it's just a matter of some procedural, I would say, technicalities that the lawyers can have control over.
From what you're saying, in the eyes of Russia, Evan's already guilty before he even gets trial. But you told The Guardian's Margaret Sullivan that you hope the solution here is political and not legal. Can you explain that?
Of course. Why it is not legal exactly for the same reasons I just spoke about. And I think political solution lies mostly with the U.S. authorities. And I was happy to see that the U.S. government designated Evan Gershkovich as an unlawfully detained person. It happened earlier this week. And as far as I understand it, certain procedures kick in under which the U.S. government can defend Evan and allocate certain resources. That's a good thing. That's a very welcome news, because it is the United States and the Russian government who are going to find a solution. And it's up to the United States government to get Evan back to the United States safe and sound. I don't think advocacy from organizations like the Committee to Protect Journalists and others is going to play a huge role here, because, as I said, the Russian authorities have spoken about Evan as if they have no doubt that he is a spy, and they will use him as a bargaining chip, trying to get as much from this situation as possible for them.
I do want to talk about the blueprint here. Is this something that you've seen before in your work with CPJ? Is this a familiar pattern involving detained journalists in Russia or other countries?
It is, as I said, not surprising that Evan Gershkovich was detained, because the most immediate gain from this situation that the Russian authorities have is to silence him. He's been in jail for, almost 2 weeks. It means that he hasn't filed a single report. He probably was working on something important that the Russian authorities didn't want to see the light of the day. and they wanted to silence him as soon as possible. Maybe he was onto some really sensitive and potentially big story. We will have to wait and hear the true version of those events from Evan himself when he's free. Speaking about other journalists charged with espionage, I can speak about Ivan Safronov, a Russian journalist who is serving a 22-year jail sentence on state treason charges. He was also accused of spying for foreign countries. And the investigation was very secretive. The trial was held behind closed doors. The case was very prominent. A lot of Russian journalists defended him because he knew him and he didn't believe, and they didn't believe that he was guilty. And another case that I can recall is that of Roman Sushchenko, a Ukrainian journalist, a correspondent, a Paris-based correspondent of the Ukrainian state news agency Ukrinform, who was detained in 2016 in Moscow when he was visiting relatives. And he was charged of espionage as well. And he was sentenced to 12 years in prison. And we wrote a letter to President Zelensky at the time asking him to include Roman Sushchenko in prisoner swap, because we also thought that that was the only way to get Sushchenko free. And he was included in 2019. He got back to Ukraine. And there have been other cases of journalists, for example, Katerina Andreeva in Belarus was finishing her initial 2-year sentence when the authorities brought new charges against her, also of state treason. And Belarus is such a closed country that we didn't get any details about the trial or about the charges specifically. And she was sentenced to a lengthy prison term as well. So this is something that the authoritarian governments use against journalists. It's not new.
As a coordinator with the CPJ, what specifically are you watching out for now? You mentioned earlier in our conversation that the United States government designating him as wrongfully detained is a good sign. It will open more doors for him for a potential release or potential solution here. But from your data and your experience in tracking these matters, what interventions are most likely and least likely to work?
I think it's important here to speak not just about the United States, but also the pressure that other governments can put on Evan Gershkovich, because if Russian authorities detained an American journalist and charged him with espionage, they could do it to any other journalist who is based in Russia or even outside. And that's the most concerning thing, because as I said, the main goal of the Russian authorities here is to silence independent reporting. Evan reported from inside Russia. He spoke to people who had anti-Kremlin or anti-war views. He traveled to the neighboring countries like Georgia and Kazakhstan, and he spoke to anti-war Russians who fled Russia in recent months. And he was that window for us, for people who are not in Russia, into Russia. He showed us the real situation there. And also, a lot of Russians, ordinary Russians, were able to speak to Evan and share their views, maybe their grievances about the situation, because one of the stories he filed was about the impact of the Western sanctions on the Russian economy. Those are the stories that the Russian authorities don't want to be published or broadcast, and that's exactly why they've been cracking down on local journalists and media outlets, forcing many journalists to flee. And if other journalists continue reporting from inside Russia independently from the Kremlin approved narrative, then, as I said, it's just a matter of time before this repression extends to them.
Do you think that you're saying this is a domino effect where it was Evan last month, it could be any foreign correspondent in Russia? What are the implications here then for the free press in Russia? Is that door essentially shut?
It's the situation, especially the charges on Evan, are very similar to the Cold War practices that the Soviet Union had. Of course, nowadays with the technologies, it's not possible to put an iron curtain between Russia and the rest of the world, especially Europe, because the information will still get out. There is the internet, there are messaging apps, although for Russians it's been impossible to access certain social media or websites, and they have to use VPN, and not all VPNs work. Not everybody knows how to use VPNs, and Russians have been very methodically trying to isolate the Russian internet from the rest of the world. So it's not an absolute isolation, but it is there are fewer and fewer voices, independent voices, that we hear from inside Russia, including through foreign media outlets that have correspondents in Russia.
If it's not an iron curtain, but we are hearing fewer voices, then what do you think the future is for foreign correspondents in Russia?
The future is very precarious. I'm sure that when foreign correspondents based in Moscow heard about Evan's detention almost 2 weeks ago, they immediately started thinking whether they should leave Russia as well. I heard about some journalists who decided to leave. I spoke to some of them personally, and a lot of newsrooms are considering whether they should keep their journalists or not. One journalist even said that it would probably be safer for foreign correspondents working in Russia to have a minder, like in the Soviet times when they had a KGB officer following them at all times, practically 24/7, because then if any charges are brought, then they wouldn't be made up as much as without a minder. So there are discussions like that, which for us, based in the United States, may seem ridiculous. But it's safe to say that every phone is bugged, everyone is followed in one way or the other, maybe not necessarily physically, but surveilled digitally. And it's not safe for foreign journalists to work in Russia. But it's also, one of the goals of the Russian authorities from this case is to sow fear among Russians, because from now on, any Russian who maybe until 2 weeks ago would be willing to speak to a foreign correspondent who would show them their press card or accreditation with the Russian Foreign Ministry, now would probably not do that, just thinking, oh, that guy from the Wall Street Journal turned out to be a spy. What if this one is also a spy? I'm better off if I don't speak to them. And that's exactly what is concerning about this situation, because journalists like Evan Gershkovich provided that platform for ordinary Russians to be heard.
You're painting a really scary picture to be a foreign correspondent today in Russia. You said it's not safe. Best case scenario, your phone's bugged. Worst case scenario, you're detained, or even worse. Do you think point blank newsrooms in the West, specifically in the United States, should start pulling their correspondents and journalists from Russia out?
As I said, I'm sure newsrooms have been discussing it. Actually, the first time they started talking about it and reaching out to CPJ was in March and April last year, because soon after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine started, the Russian authorities started amending their legislation, making it practically impossible to report independently about the conflict in Ukraine. They banned the use of the word war, for example, and it was easy to get charged with distributing fakes if you reported on the Russian army or other state agencies' activities abroad, including in Ukraine. And at the time, newsrooms were consulting their safety experts and lawyers to see the impact of those changes in Russian legislation on them. And some newsrooms, some media outlets pulled their correspondents out of Russia, and some of them went back. But it is clear that after Evan's case, it won't be just some technical reasons for which the Russian authorities will expel journalists. It will be something very serious. And also, the second part of my answer is that it also depends on what media outlet the journalist represents. Because the other day I checked the Russian Foreign Ministry website for the list of all accredited journalists. And the list is quite extensive. It includes journalists from many different countries, from Belarus to China, from Armenia and Kazakhstan to Vietnam. There are European media outlets who have correspondents in Russia. I think Evan was targeted in this predatory way exactly because he is from the United States. So we're basically going to the beginning of our conversation about the relationships between Russia and the West, and how Russia sees the West and the Western hand in the war in Ukraine. So journalists representing media outlets from those countries that have been supportive of Ukraine, that have been providing aid to Ukraine, that have been critical of Russia, Russia's human rights and press freedom record, those journalists are more vulnerable. They are on the first line of this repressive machine.
I do want to talk about now what a potential release of Evan looks like, because we saw earlier this year, I know she's not a journalist, but WNBA star Britany Griner was involved in a prisoner swap with the arms dealer nicknamed the Merchant of Death. Would Evan potentially, I know we don't know this yet, have to, if he's convicted, serve that lengthy prison sentence, or do you think Russia is eyeing him for a prisoner swap?
You know, right now, either scenario is possible. What we heard from the Russian officials is that even if prisoner swap takes place, it's not going to be until after the conviction, because that's been the practice. And as we've seen with the case of Ivan Safronov, the investigation and then the trial could last for many months. So we're speaking about Evan staying in detention, not just until May 29th, because that's the initial stage of detention. It's very likely that the prosecutors will ask, the investigators will ask the judge to extend that period, and then they will be given another 6 months and so on. In the meantime, the Russians will try to get as much benefit from this situation as possible. So I personally think that the prisoners' exchange is the most likely scenario, but it's not going to happen until many months from now, unless, of course, the US government has some other tools that I'm not aware of.
And I know he's not a journalist, but Paul Whelan was an American who is a former Marine, was also detained in Russia in 2018. He was charged in 2020 with spying. Does his being in Russia, being imprisoned there for 16 years does that impact Evan's case at all? Do you think both of them could be involved in the prisoner swap?
Well, we can speculate here. As far as I know, for example, when the US was negotiating the prisoner exchange of Griner for Victor Bout, Whelan was also supposed to be a part of that exchange, but then it didn't work in that format. So it was 1-to-1, although, of course, any reasonable person would think that the charges of both, Griner on the one hand, on Bout on the other, are just so different that it was ridiculous. But in this case, I think the United States authorities will consider different options. Also, I think what is important here is that a person who may eventually be swapped for Evan Gershkovich may not necessarily be from the United States, or they may be detained in the future. We don't know that because Russia, by detaining Evan Gershkovich, is now trying to get, as I said, as much benefit from this situation as possible. It was very interesting to watch some Russian State Duma members to discuss Evan Gershkovich's case, and they were throwing names of people for whom they can exchange Evan, and former President Donald Trump was one of the names. Julian Assange was another name. So it sounded ridiculous last week when I heard it. On the other hand, I know that State Duma and some deputies, some members of it, often serve as a testing field for different ideas, and many months later, those ideas in some cases materialized, although at the initial stage they sounded very ridiculous. And obviously we at CPJ are going to continue monitoring the situation and trying to help Evan and his family and his colleagues as much as possible. And we hope that, I personally hope that I'm wrong in many of my predictions, and it will not take many months before we see Evan safe and sound on the U.S. soil.
From what you're saying, it sounds like Evan is being used as a bargaining chip from Russia, whether it be present or in the future. But to close this out, what would be your message to Evan Gershkovich now?
As far as I understand, Evan knows the huge support he's received so far. What is important is to continue supporting him, continue sharing his stories. As you know, the journal lifted the paywall on his stories, so it's very easy to read them, and they are great stories. I, as a journalist myself, can tell you that they're great stories, and that's why it breaks my heart to see him detained, because in these 13 or so days since his detention, he could have filed at least one or probably two or three really great stories. I have no doubt that they would be great as well. So continue supporting and continue keeping attention on his case, because we journalists know how the news cycle works. There is always another breaking story, and the attention is drawn from one case to the next. Let's keep attention on Evan. Let's keep supporting him, because even not immediately, but at some point he will know, he will hear all these supportive voices, and he needs them.
Gulnoza Said, thank you for the important conversation.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.